The pediatric ward at St. Margaret's Hospital had seen its share of emotional moments, but none quite like this. 8-year-old Oliver Wright's desperate sobs echoed through the sterile corridors, his small fingers clutching Dr. Emma Bennett's white coat with surprising strength. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his tear-stained face as he pleaded, "Please, please don't make me go with him." Emma felt her heart constrict as she watched Oliver's stepfather, James Harrison, shifting impatiently by the discharge desk. There was something in the man's demeanor that set off warning bells in her mind, a barely contained aggression that seemed to simmer beneath his carefully constructed facade of concern. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who had faced more than his share of hardships, but it was his eyes that troubled Emma the most. They held a darkness she couldn't quite place, flickering between anxiety and something harder, colder. "Come on, Oliver. We need to get home," James called out, his voice carrying an edge that made Oliver flinch. The boy's grip on Emma's coat tightened, his knuckles turning white with the effort. Emma had treated countless children during her tenure at St. Margaret's, but Oliver was different. He'd been admitted 3 weeks ago with severe pneumonia, his small body racked with fever and struggling for every breath. Throughout his treatment, she'd noticed how he seemed to bloom during his hospital stay, becoming more animated and engaged with each passing day. It wasn't just the antibiotics and breathing treatments that had brought color back to his cheeks. It was as if the hospital itself had become a sanctuary. Now, watching him regress into terror at the mere thought of leaving, Emma knew she couldn't ignore her instincts. 15 years of medical practice had taught her to trust her gut, and right now, every fiber of her being was screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Mr. Harrison," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional, "could I have a word with you in private?" She gently disentangled Oliver's fingers from her coat, squeezing his hand reassuringly before leading James into a nearby consultation room. The conversation that followed did little to allay her concerns. James's explanations about Oliver's home life were vague, peppered with inconsistencies that niggled at Emma's trained mind. He spoke of recent job losses, of struggling to make ends meet, of doing his best as a single parent, all delivered with a defensive aggression that seemed to dare her to question him further. After they left the hospital, Emma found herself unable to shake her unease. She made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. She would follow them. It wasn't protocol, it probably wasn't even legal, but something told her that Oliver's life might depend on it. The journey took her through increasingly dilapidated neighborhoods, past boarded-up shops and graffiti-covered walls, until James's battered Ford finally stopped outside a Victorian terrace house that had seen far better days. The building's facade was crumbling, with missing roof tiles and windows that had been hastily patched with cardboard and tape. Emma parked her car at a discreet distance, watching as James practically dragged Oliver inside. The boy's resistance was visible even from where she sat, his small body leaning away from his stepfather's grip. Through a gap in the curtains, she caught glimpses of the interior, peeling wallpaper, stacks of unwashed dishes, and what appeared to be black mold creeping up the walls. Her medical mind immediately cataloged the dangers: respiratory irritants, potential allergens, unsafe living conditions that would almost certainly exacerbate Oliver's recently treated pneumonia. But it was the sound that drifted through a partially open window that truly chilled her. The sharp crack of something solid hitting a wall, followed by Oliver's muffled whimper. Emma's hand was already reaching for her phone when she spotted movement in an upstairs window. Oliver's pale face appeared briefly, his eyes wide and searching, before he was roughly pulled away from view. The curtain swayed for a moment before falling still, leaving Emma with a decision that would haunt her if she made the wrong choice. She thought of her own comfortable home, of the safety and security she took for granted. She thought of all the times in her career when she'd suspected something was wrong, but had convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere. She thought of Oliver's desperate grip on her coat, his silent plea for help. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street as Emma began documenting everything she could see. She took photos of the house's condition, noted down times and observations, and started composing a mental list of everyone she would need to contact. This wasn't just about treating physical symptoms anymore. It was about saving a child from whatever darkness lurked behind those grimy windows. As night began to fall, Emma reluctantly started her car, knowing she couldn't maintain her vigil forever. But she made a silent promise to the frightened boy she'd left behind. This wasn't over. She would find a way to help him, no matter what it took. The weight of that promise settled around her shoulders like a mantle as she drove home, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. What she didn't know then was that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test her professional boundaries, challenge her understanding of family, and ultimately redefine what it means to heal. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles, heartbreak, and unexpected allies, but Emma Bennett had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when a child's future hung in the balance. The following days became a careful dance of observation and investigation. Emma arranged her rounds to ensure she could pass by Oliver's house at different times, building a picture of the daily rhythms of the Harrison household. She noticed how James would leave early in the morning, returning late in the evening with the unsteady gait of someone who'd found solace in a bottle. Oliver, meanwhile, seemed to exist like a ghost in his own home, his silhouette occasionally visible through windows but never venturing outside. Emma's colleagues at St. Margaret's had begun to notice her preoccupation. Sarah, her closest friend and fellow pediatrician, caught her researching child protection procedures during lunch breaks. "You've got that look again," Sarah said one afternoon, sliding into the chair opposite Emma in the hospital cafeteria. "The one you get when you're about to do something either brilliant or completely mad." Emma pushed aside her untouched sandwich and lowered her voice. "Something's wrong, Sarah. I can feel it in my bones. That boy, the way he begged to stay here. I've been watching his house." "You've been what?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Emma, that's inappropriate? Possibly illegal? Trust me, I know." Emma ran a hand through her hair, a habit she developed during her residency years when faced with particularly challenging cases. "But you didn't see his face. You didn't hear the sounds coming from that house." Before Sarah could respond, Emma's phone buzzed with an alert from the hospital's emergency department. A familiar name flashed across the screen: Oliver Wright. Emma's heart raced as she hurried to the ED, her mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. She found Oliver sitting on an examination bed, his arm cradled against his chest, James hovering nearby, with an explanation about a fall down the stairs ready on his lips. "He's always been clumsy," James said, his words slightly slurred despite the early hour. "Boys will be boys, right?" Emma examined Oliver's arm, noting the peculiar pattern of bruising that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall. More concerning, the older marks she discovered. Healing bruises in various stages, small circular burns that looked suspiciously like cigarette marks. "Oliver," Emma said gently, positioning herself between the boy and his stepfather. "Can you tell me what happened?" Oliver's eyes darted to James, then back to Emma. His lower lip trembled as he opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, James's sharp voice cut through the air. "He told you he fell. Christ, can a kid have an accident without everyone assuming the worst?" Emma maintained her professional composure, but her mind was racing. She needed to buy time, needed to find a way to keep Oliver safe while she gathered enough evidence to involve the authorities. An idea began to form, risky, potentially career-ending if it backfired, but she couldn't see another way. "Mr. Harrison," she said, turning to face him, "I'm concerned about possible complications from Oliver's recent pneumonia. Given his history, I'd like to admit him for observation." James's face darkened. "More hospital bills?" "We can't afford. I'll handle the paperwork," Emma interrupted smoothly. Given Oliver's recent admission, this would be considered a related complication. Insurance should cover it. She watched James calculate the possibilities, saw the moment when the promise of avoiding medical bills outweighed his suspicion. He agreed, though not without shooting Oliver a look that made the boy shrink further into himself. Once James had left to smoke outside, Emma seized her chance. She perched on the edge of Oliver's bed, keeping her voice low and gentle. "Oliver, sweetheart, I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you in this hospital. Can you tell me what's really been happening at home?" The story that tumbled out between sobs and whispers was worse than Emma had imagined. James's drinking had escalated since losing his job 6 months ago. The house had no heating, little food, and Oliver often went to bed hungry and cold. The physical abuse had started gradually, a shove here, a slap there, but had grown increasingly violent as James's frustration with their circumstances mounted. "Please," Oliver whispered, his good hand clutching Emma's sleeve just as it had days before. "Don't send me back there. He'll kill me if he knows I told you." Emma felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Listen to me very carefully, Oliver. I promise you, right here and right now, that I will not let that happen. Do you understand? I will find a way to keep you safe." She meant every word, though she had no idea yet how she would fulfill that promise. What she did know was that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just Oliver's doctor. She had become his advocate, his protector, and possibly his only hope for escape. As she watched Oliver finally drift off to sleep, sedated by pain medication and exhaustion, Emma began to formulate a plan. She would need help, legal help, certainly, but also support from colleagues who could document Oliver's injuries, social workers who could navigate the complex child protection system, and perhaps most importantly, allies who could provide a safe haven for Oliver once the inevitable confrontation with James occurred. What Emma didn't realize was that her decision to help Oliver would not only change his life, but would also force her to confront her own past traumas and preconceptions about family, loyalty, and justice. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but as she watched Oliver's peaceful sleeping face, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in quiet moments between midnight observations and early morning rounds. Emma had arranged for Oliver to be placed in a private room, away from the busy pediatric ward where James would have difficulty accessing him without being said. It was during one of these quiet nights that she found James sitting alone in the hospital chapel, his head in his hands. The man who looked up at her approach seemed older than his 38 years. Grief and exhaustion etched deeply into his face. The aggression that had characterized their previous interactions was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that Emma recognized from her years working with parents at their breaking point. "I suppose you're here to tell me I'm a monster," James said, his voice hoarse. "You wouldn't be wrong." Emma sat beside him, maintaining a professional distance while leaving space for conversation. "I'm here to understand," she replied simply. The story that followed revealed layers of complexity that Emma hadn't anticipated. James had met Oliver's mother, Charlotte, when Oliver was just 3 years old. Charlotte had been beautiful, charismatic, and utterly unreliable, disappearing for days at a time, leaving James to care for her young son. Despite not being Oliver's biological father, James had grown to love the boy as his own. "I used to be different," James said, staring at his hands. "Had a good job in construction, a nice flat in a decent area. Charlotte, she had a way about her, made you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. But she also had demons, drugs mostly. Started small, but you know how these things go." Emma did know. She'd seen the pattern often enough in her professional life. The gradual descent into addiction, the way it corroded relationships and destroyed families. "She cleaned up for a while after we got married," James continued. "Things were good. Oliver was happy, doing well in school. Then her old friends came back around, and it all went to hell again. Last time I saw her, she'd emptied our savings account and disappeared with some bloke she'd met at a party. That was 18 months ago." The timeline matched with the deterioration of Oliver's home life that Emma had observed. "And the drinking?" she prompted gently. James laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty chapel. "Started as a way to sleep through the night. Then it was a way to forget during the day. Lost my job when I showed up drunk once too often. After that," he gestured vaguely, "everything just kept getting worse. Oliver deserved better than what I became." Emma felt her perspective shifting. James wasn't the monster she'd imagined. He was a broken man who had tried to be a father and failed, spectacularly and tragically. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped her understand them. "Charlotte's back," James said suddenly, causing Emma to start. "Showed up last week, talking about how she's changed, how she wants Oliver back. Says she'll go to court if she has to. That's why." He trailed off, but Emma could fill in the blanks. The increased violence, the desperate attempts to maintain control. They were the actions of a man terrified of losing the only family he had left. "You know I have to report the abuse," Emma said quietly. "There's no coming back from what you've done to him." James nodded, tears falling freely now. "I know. God help me, I know. Just promise me one thing. Don't let her take him. Charlotte, she'll destroy him in ways that'll never heal. At least my marks will fade." The conversation continued through the night, with James revealing more details about Charlotte's history of neglect and manipulation. Emma listened, taking mental notes while maintaining her professional demeanor. By the time dawn began to paint the chapel windows with pale light, she had a clearer picture of the situation and a growing sense of what needed to be done. The next few days became a careful orchestration of resources and support. Emma contacted her friend Michael Preston, a family law solicitor who had helped with similar cases in the past. She compiled medical records, documented injuries, and began building a case that would protect T. Oliver not just from James's violence, but also from Charlotte's potential return. What surprised her most was James's cooperation. Once the facade of aggression cracked, he seemed almost relieved to have someone take control of the situation. He signed voluntary temporary custody agreements, provided documentation of Charlotte's abandonment, and agreed to enter an alcohol rehabilitation program. "I love that boy," he told Emma during one of their discussions. "Enough to know that right now, I'm not what he needs. But please, don't let him think I abandoned him too. Let him know that sometimes love means letting go until you're strong enough to do better." Emma found herself in the unexpected position of becoming a bridge between Oliver and the man who had both protected and hurt him. She watched as Oliver struggled to reconcile his fear of James with his memories of better times, observed the complicated emotions that played across his face when she delivered messages from his stepfather. The situation became even more complex when Charlotte suddenly appeared at the hospital, every inch the concerned mother returning to claim her child. She was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes that spoke of someone else's money. Her performance of maternal concern was flawless, but Emma caught the calculating looks, the way her eyes darted around the room, assessing angles and advantages. It was Oliver's reaction that confirmed Emma's suspicions. The boy, who had begun to regain some of his confidence during his hospital stay, became physically ill at the sight of his mother. Later, in the safety of his private room, he revealed fragments of memories. Nights left alone while Charlotte entertained various boyfriends, occasions when she had used him to shoplift or distract security guards, times when she had disappeared for weeks only to return as if nothing had happened. The transition from hospital to hope began on a crisp autumn morning, when Emma made a decision that would challenge every professional boundary she'd established over her career. Her family owned a modest cottage in the Cotswolds, a peaceful retreat that had sat empty since her parents' retirement to Cornwall. As she watched Oliver anxiously picking at his hospital breakfast, knowing that discharge was becoming medically impossible to delay further, the solution crystallized in her mind. "Oliver," she said, sitting at the edge of his bed, "how would you feel about staying somewhere peaceful for a while? Somewhere with a garden and trees and a room of your own?" The boy's eyes widened, hope and suspicion warring in his expression. He learned the hard way not to trust easily, but something in Emma's steady gaze made him lean forward. "Where?" Emma described the cottage, painting pictures with her words of the climbing roses that covered its stone walls, the small vegetable garden her mother had lovingly maintained, and the ancient oak tree that stood guard over the back garden. She watched as Oliver's imagination caught fire, saw the moment when possibility began to overcome fear. The legal arrangements were complex, but not impossible. Michael Preston worked tirelessly to establish a temporary guardianship arrangement, arguing successfully that Oliver's medical condition required specialized care in a controlled environment. James, still struggling with his own demons, but showing surprising clarity, signed the necessary papers from his rehabilitation facility. Charlotte's attempts to intervene were thwarted by her own criminal record and a series of damning witness statements from her past. The cottage required work to make it suitable for a child. Emma spent her free weekends driving up from London, cleaning away years of dust, fixing stuck windows, and transforming the small second bedroom into a space that could belong to a little boy. She bought bright bedding with spacecraft patterns, filled bookshelves with adventures and mysteries, and hung star charts on the walls. Her father, Richard, a retired engineer with a perpetual project itch, threw himself into the renovation with enthusiasm. "Every child needs a proper desk for homework," he declared, appearing one weekend with a beautifully restored antique school desk he'd found at an auction. He spent hours carefully sanding and refinishing it, explaining each step to an increasingly interested Oliver, who had begun spending weekends at the cottage while the final legal details were arranged. Emma's mother, Grace, approached the situation with practical warmth. She arrived with casseroles and detailed instructions about proper nutrition for growing boys, then proceeded to teach Oliver how to make his own breakfast and pack a school lunch. "Independence," she insisted, "begins with knowing how to take care of yourself." The local primary school, a small institution with experience handling sensitive cases, agreed to accept Oliver midterm. The head teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had worked with traumatized children before and understood the importance of creating a safe, predictable environment. She assigned Oliver to Mr. Parker's class, known for his gentle approach to learning and strong emphasis on building confidence through achievement. Oliver's first day at Meadowbrook Primary was a study in careful optimism. Emma had taken time off work to drive him to school, watching as he clutched his new backpack like a shield. Mr. Parker, a tall man with kind eyes and a quiet voice, met them at the classroom door. "We've got a special project starting today," he told Oliver, leading him to a table where other children were gathering. "We're building a model of the solar system. I hear you're interested in space." The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Each day brought small victories. Oliver raising his hand in class to answer a question, joining a group of boys for football during break time, bringing home artwork to be proudly displayed on the cottage's refrigerator. The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent, less violent. James's progress in rehabilitation paralleled his stepson's healing. He wrote letters, carefully reviewed by Emma before being shared with Oliver, expressing remorse without excuses and hope without demands. The letters spoke of his own therapy, of understanding the cycles of violence he'd perpetuated, of his desire to become someone worthy of trust again. Emma found herself navigating unfamiliar territory, balancing her role as a doctor with these new responsibilities. She arranged her hospital shifts to ensure she could be home when Oliver returned from school, learned to cook meals more complicated than microwave-ready meals, and discovered that reading bedtime stories could be the highlight of her day. The cottage began to transform as well, losing its museum-like quality and gaining the comfortable chaos of a lived-in home. Oliver's wellies appeared by the back door, his coat hung on its own special hook, and his art projects gradually covered more and more wall space. The garden, which had been primarily decorative, now included a small vegetable patch where Oliver grew radishes and lettuce under Grace's careful guidance. Richard, who had initially approached the situation with practical concern about his daughter's career, became Oliver's most devoted advocate. He taught the boy how to use basic tools, starting with supervised projects in his workshop. Together they built a birdhouse, installed it in the oak tree, and spent hours identifying the various species that came to visit. "You know," Richard said to Emma one evening, watching Oliver carefully counting birds in a notebook they created together, "sometimes the family you choose is more important than the one you're born into." Emma understood the deeper meaning behind her father's words. She had chosen to be part of Oliver's story, just as he had chosen to true. Her. The boundaries between professional obligation and personal commitment had blurred beyond recognition, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The cottage became more than just a safe house. It became a place of healing for everyone involved. James, allowed supervised visits after completing his rehabilitation program, found that the peaceful environment helped him maintain his sobriety. Even some of Oliver's school friends began visiting for carefully planned playdates, filling the once quiet rooms with laughter and the kind of chaos that only preteen boys can create. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were setbacks. Days when Oliver withdrew into himself. Moments when a loud noise or sudden movement would trigger a panic attack. Nights when the past crept into his dreams and left him screaming. Emma learned to recognize the signs, to provide space when needed and comfort when accepted. She developed a sixth sense for his moods, knowing when to push gently forward and when to allow retreat. The medical community had mixed reactions to Emma's involvement. Some colleagues praised her dedication, while others whispered about professional boundaries and potential ethical violations. Emma found she cared less about these opinions with each passing day, measuring her success instead by Oliver's growing confidence and healing spirit. Emma's professional reputation had always been built on careful observation and methodical documentation. These habits proved invaluable as the legal battle for Oliver's future began to unfold. Charlotte's sudden reappearance in their lives came with a team of aggressive solicitors and a carefully crafted narrative of maternal redemption that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. The first indication of trouble arrived on a Thursday morning, when Emma found a formal legal notice waiting in her mailbox. The thick envelope contained dozens of pages of legal terminology, but the essence was clear. Charlotte was petitioning for immediate custody restoration, claiming that Emma had manipulated the situation to kidnap her son. The allegations were both ridiculous and dangerous. Accusations of professional misconduct, suggestions of emotional manipulation, and hints of financial exploitation. "She's trying to paint me as the villain," Emma explained to Michael Preston over coffee in his London office. The solicitor's usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by focused concentration as he reviewed the documents. "Charlotte's clever," Michael admitted, spreading the papers across his mahogany desk. "She's found a solicitor who specializes in maternal rights cases. They're arguing that her abandonment was due to untreated postpartum depression, that she's since received treatment, and that she's now stable and capable of providing for Oliver. They've even secured character witnesses, including, rather surprisingly, Oliver's biological father." Emma felt her stomach lurch. "I thought he'd never been in the picture?" Apparently, Charlotte's managed to locate him. Marcus Webb, successful businessman, married with 2 other children. They're presenting him as a potential stability factor, suggesting a co-parenting arrangement between Charlotte and Marcus that would provide Oliver with a proper family environment. The idea of Oliver being forced into yet another unfamiliar situation, especially with people who had never shown any interest in his welfare before, made Emma's blood boil. But she forced herself to remain calm, to think like the medical professional she was. "We have documentation," she said, pulling out her own folder. "Every injury Oliver arrived with at the hospital, every sign of neglect, every conversation with teachers about his irregular attendance before we got involved. We have James's testimony about Charlotte's drug use, police reports from domestic disturbances at their old address, and statements from Oliver's previous school about chronic absenteeism during Charlotte's custody." Michael nodded, but his expression remained grave. "All valuable, but they're countering with evidence of rehabilitation. Charlotte's completed a drug treatment program, maintained employment for 6 months, and secured a flat in a good school district. She's also engaged to a man with a stable career in finance. On paper, she's presenting herself as a reformed mother desperate to reunite with her child." The legal proceedings that followed became a marathon of hearings, assessments, and testimonies. Emma found herself walking a delicate line between her role as Oliver's current guardian and her professional position as a doctor. She watched as Charlotte performed perfectly for court-appointed evaluators, presenting herself as a woman who had made mistakes but learned from them, who only wanted a chance to be the mother her son deserved. Oliver, meanwhile, retreated into himself as the pressure mounted. His nightmares returned with devastating frequency, and his progress at school began to falter. The mere mention of court appearances or evaluations would trigger panic attacks that left him hyperventilating and trembling. During one particularly difficult evening, after Oliver had finally fallen asleep following hours of anxiety-induced insomnia, Emma sat in her father's workshop, surrounded by the comforting smell of sawdust and varnish. "You know," Richard said, carefully sanding the edges of what would become a bookshelf for Oliver's room, "when your mother and I adopted you, we faced similar challenges." Emma looked up sharply. Her adoption had rarely been discussed in the family, not because it was a secret, but because it had never seemed relevant to their relationship. "What do you mean?" Your biological mother changed her mind after the adoption was finalized. Showed up with lawyers, claiming she'd been coerced, that she'd made a mistake. We spent months in court, fighting to keep you. He set down his sandpaper, meeting Emma's eyes. The difference is, you were too young to remember. Oliver isn't. The parallel struck Emma with profound force. Perhaps this was why she'd felt such an immediate connection to Oliver's situation. Some deep, unconscious recognition of shared experience. "How did you win?" she asked quietly. Richard smiled, the expression gentle but determined. "We proved that stability and love matter more than biological connections. We showed that family is about choice and commitment, not just DNA. And most importantly, we never gave up." The conversation gave Emma renewed energy for the legal battle ahead. She worked with Michael to build a comprehensive case that focused not just on Charlotte's past failures, but on Oliver's current well-being. They gathered testimony from his teachers about his academic improvement, from his therapist about his emotional progress, and from various community members who had witnessed his transformation from a frightened, withdrawn child to an increasingly confident young boy. James, now 6 months sober, provided crucial testimony about Charlotte's history of abandonment and manipulation. His honest acknowledgement of his own failures, coupled with his clear prioritization of Oliver's welfare over his own desires, carried significant weight with the court. But the most powerful moment came when Oliver himself requested to speak to the judge. Despite Emma's concerns about the potential trauma, Oliver insisted that he needed to be heard. The private meeting in the judge's chambers lasted nearly an hour, during which Oliver explained in his own words why he couldn't return to Charlotte. "She doesn't love me," he told the judge, his voice quiet but steady. "She loves the idea of having me, like I'm a toy she forgot about and now wants back. But Dr. Bennett, Emma, she loves me enough to help me become better, even when it's hard. She's teaching me that love isn't supposed to hurt." The judge, a seasoned professional who had heard countless custody disputes, was visibly moved by Oliver's clarity and insight. The turning point came when Oliver described his new life, not in terms of material comfort or advantages, but in terms of feeling safe, valued, and capable of growth. The judge's chambers became silent after Oliver's testimony, the weight of his words hanging in the air like early morning mist. What followed was a series of legal proceedings that would permanently reshape the landscape of multiple lives. The judge's final ruling came down like a thunderclap on a clear day. Emma would retain primary custody of Oliver, with James granted supervised visitation, rights contingent upon his continued sobriety. Charlotte's petition was denied, though she would be permitted to send letters through Michael's office after a 6-month cooling-off period. The victory, while complete, brought with it new challenges and responsibilities. Emma found herself navigating the complex terrain of becoming a full-time parent, a role she had never anticipated when she first followed her medical instincts that fateful day. The cottage, once a weekend retreat, transformed into a permanent home filled with the everyday chaos of raising a growing boy. Richard and Grace, far from stepping back once the legal battle was won, became even more involved in Oliver's life. Richard converted half of his workshop into a dedicated space for Oliver's growing interest in engineering and mechanics. Together, they embarked on increasingly ambitious projects, from rebuilding an old bicycle to constructing a telescope from scratch. "You see," Richard would explain, guiding Oliver's hands as they adjusted the focusing mechanism, "everything worthwhile takes time and patience. Whether you're healing a broken bone or building a telescope, rushing never helps." Grace, meanwhile, channeled her energy into creating traditions that would give Oliver the sense of permanence he desperately needed. Sunday roast became an immutable fixture, with Oliver gradually taking on more responsibility in the kitchen. She taught him family recipes, each one coming with stories that helped weave him into the fabric of their shared history. "These Yorkshire puddings," she'd say, showing him how to whisk the batter just so, "were your grandfather's favorite. He used to say they were better than any he had during the war, though I suspect that wasn't saying much, poor man." Emma watched these interactions with a mixture of joy and wonder, seeing how naturally Oliver fit into their family dynamic. The boy who had once flinched at sudden movements now laughed freely, his voice filling the cottage with the kind of happiness that seemed to make the very walls glow warmer. The transformation extended beyond the family sphere. At Meadowbrook Primary, Oliver's academic performance continued to improve, bolstered by the stability in his home life. Mr. Parker noted that Oliver had become something of a leader in class, particularly when it came to helping new students feel welcome. "He has a special way with the shy ones," Mr. Parker explained during a parent-teacher conference that still felt surreal to Emma. "It's as if he can sense when someone feels out of place, and he knows exactly how to make them feel included without drawing attention to their discomfort." This empathy extended to James as well, whose journey through recovery paralleled Oliver's healing. Their supervised visits, initially tense and awkward, gradually evolved into meaningful interactions. James, stripped of the anger that had once defined him, revealed himself to be capable of genuine connection when not clouded by alcohol,